Hello, folks, and welcome this afternoon. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Saving Our Seas, Protecting Our Oceans for Future Generations, which is a day or an event being held by the University of Exeter to celebrate World Oceans Day. And we're here in the Environment and Sustainability Institute on Exeter's Penryn campus for those who are joining us online. And thanks to everyone who's come here this evening live, and thanks to those who are joining us online, because this is an event being streamed online simultaneously. So I am Callum Roberts, and I'm Professor of Marine Conservation here at Exeter, and I work on the Penryn campus. I'm in charge of a few projects, including the Convex Seascape Survey, which is a 5-year survey of ocean carbon stocks, and we're looking at how important they are in combating climate change and looking at whether they're at risk from human activities or not. So today is World Oceans Day, an international day of recognition that aims to raise awareness and about the importance of the ocean environment and to build public interest in and protection for the ocean and sustainable management of its resources. And the theme of World Ocean Day this year is Tides Are Changing. And indeed, we're going to talk about how those tides are changing with an excellent panel of speakers who I will introduce in a moment. So historically, despite our dependence on the ocean and our very long history of association with the sea and ocean life, very little of it has been protected. We're at about 8% now in the way of any protection at all, and only a small amount has been explored. Roughly a quarter of the ocean seabed has been mapped in any level of detail. However, attention is now shifting very much more to the ocean, and this spring, the United Nations High Seas Treaty was agreed, and the High Seas Treaty will, among other things, facilitate the creation of marine protected areas in international waters beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, and it will put more money into conservation and help us control use of resources like fisheries. So in a moment, we're going to delve deeper into this new treaty and see how marine protected areas can help and can be created to support the protection and management of marine life on the high seas. But first, I'd like to introduce Hugo Tagholm, who is our first speaker this evening. And Hugo is an honorary graduate of the University of Exeter and a very long-term environmental campaigner. He lives and works here in Cornwall, and for 14 years led the organization Surfers Against Sewage from their office in St. Agnes. And during this time, Hugo also found time somehow to found Plastic Free Communities movement, the Million Mile Beach Clean and Safer Seas service, and was instrumental in exposing water company sewage pollution, which has awareness of which now spreads to every corner of society in the UK. And just as he was about to nail it and get the sewage eliminated from the system, he has jumped ship and is now heading up the organization Oceana in the UK. And Oceana is an international organization that conducts science-based policy campaigns, and since its founding in 2001 has won more than 275 victories and helped protect nearly 4 million square miles. It's a US-based organization. Everything's measured in miles there. Please join me in giving Hugo a very warm welcome this afternoon.
Thanks, Callum, for that kind introduction. I'm still going to try and nail it with the government on this water quality issue too. I'm actually going to the High Court with the Good Law Project in 3 weeks' time to challenge them on their dismal performance so far on sewage pollution in our rivers and on our coastline. And of course, delighted to see Surfers Against Sewage continuing to do the good work on it too. Look, good afternoon, everyone, here and online. I'm really delighted to be here today. Happy World Ocean Day. It's fantastic to be here and to share the stage with so many amazing people who I can call friends after years of campaigning together and being allies and standing shoulder to shoulder on the big issues. The ocean hasn't been the big issue in the public space for a long time, but now it really is. There's never been a more important time for our seas. This is the ocean decade, and I'm inspired by the expertise, the passion, the commitment and dedication that I see growing day to day for the protection and the restoration of the ocean. In an almost relentlessly negative daily news cycle, it fills me with hope to see this movement growing to defend planet ocean. And so thank you all for what you do. Thank you for your interest and for your dedication to make a difference. Now, as Callum said, Oceana is one of the largest marine conservation and advocacy campaigning groups in the world, with offices in 15 countries, a headquarters in Washington, D.C. It's a leader in science-based advocacy, and we campaign to make policies and change policies to make the world's oceans more abundant, more vibrant, and more biodiverse. Globally, Oceana has won more than 275 policy victories for marine life and habitats, from stopping bottom trawling in sensitive areas to protecting sea turtles from commercial fishing gear, and most importantly, and one of the things that attracted me to working with the organisation, stopping the expansion of new offshore oil and gas from our seas, which is a really important topic here in the UK alongside the sewage debate. But as Callum said, before joining Oceana, I led the campaigning organisation Surfers Against Sewage, which sort of feels like a child of mine in some ways. Very proud of what we did there, acting from the beachfront to the front benches of Parliament and securing government legislation to protect our seas from plastic, from sewage and from pollutants. And over the time I was there, we grew into one of the biggest ocean community movements in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people working with us at beach cleans, at citizen science, helping with health research, campaigning and education on the ground. And I'm so proud to have worked with so many people, and I'm sure some of you online and here have been involved in SAS activities. And I'm so proud that we managed to empower so many people, diverse people around the country and around the world, to take action with us. And I'm even more proud to see the organisation going from strength to strength with its current team. It's a huge issue, not just the sewage debate, but all of the issues that they work on. And local people are vital in helping protect our coastline and ocean. And during my time there, I helped deliver the plastic bag charge, the commitment for a deposit return scheme, which seems to be wavering now, which is something we need to get the government back online with, and the current campaign to expose water company sewage pollution, which has grown, as Callum says, into a fierce national debate, a very political debate now, as we approach the sort of ramp to the general election. And working with all of those volunteers and a fantastic team of trustees and volunteers and a fantastic team, I was so pleased to see that periphery issue, one that no one really wanted to talk about some 5 or 6 years ago, into one of the dominant environmental issues of the day, such a huge issue for our ocean. But whilst I'm proud of the wins we helped deliver, our campaigns all too often exposed the weak enforcement of environmental regulations, the glacial pace to adopt and implement new policy and legislation, and a selective approach to concrete evidence to protect the environment, and an almost infinite ability of big business to undermine our work in the name of their profits. Something we see every day with water companies, with big oil, with big plastics. No matter which industry, it seems that they forget that there's no business on a dead planet. As Jacques Cousteau said, and one of my heroes said decades ago, water and air, the two essential fluids on which all life depends, have become global garbage cans. Despite the progress we've made collectively since he uttered these words, this remains sadly the case more than ever before, with carbon dioxide and the level of pollutants going into our ocean. Our rivers and our seas are treated like open sewers, plastic sewage, industrial waste, agricultural waste, chemicals and effluents spewed out daily. An atmosphere treated like an open carbon sewer too, smokestacks, jet engines and industry accelerating emissions ever since the first COP meeting decades ago. Yet despite these sort of polluted headwinds and waters, I feel hope building all of the time. As people organise, as people conduct more research and rise, as people demand more, and rightfully so in this ocean decade. In the ocean community, this often comes from the magic and splendour of our seas and the direct interaction that we all have with blue spaces that are still pulsating with life. There are many blue strongholds left, and the ocean-growing community is at the forefront of their defence. The divers, the ocean scientists, the surfers, the sailors, the low-impact fishers, and the coastal communities. And it won't surprise you to know that I'm a surfer. This is what drives me and takes me to so many amazing places, including Mayernport over the last few evenings, actually. Some pretty good waves. And whatever we love to do in the sea, the regular immersion also exposes us to all of these issues. The tide lines of plastic, the changing environment, the sewage-filled river mouths, which started that debate that we see at that political level now, and the animals entangled in ghost gear, issues that are now a shared global challenge. We do, after all, live on planet Ocean, as this map so clearly shows. The ocean connects us, but also connects and transports the pollution we create. Plastics are found throughout the water cycle, in the rain, on mountain tops, up and down the water column, in the deepest parts of the sea, and on snowy hills. The pollution conveyor belts cross national boundaries, jump from national waters to national waters. Fish populations are weakened as they move and are targeted from country to country. Companies and countries monopolize wealth and distribute their harm. This polluting Ponzi scheme all too often relies on the air and the water to conceal their transactions. So what are we doing at Oceana in the UK? Well, tackling the impacts of overfishing and calling out weakly enforced marine protected areas, or paper parks as they're known, is a central element of Oceana campaigns around the world. The over-industrialization of our seas is consistently decimating fish populations and ripping apart our ecosystems. It's also taking away the livelihoods of low-impact fishers around the world. As with many environmental issues, scientific guidance is all too often ignored by policymakers as they set fishing quotas and rubber-stamp the industrial exploitation of our seas, effectively fast-tracking the destruction of marine life. Just over a third of catch limits in 2020, 2021, and 2022 actually followed scientific advice. So that's almost 70% that actually were destroying those fish populations. This approach takes us closer to population collapse for some of our fish populations around the UK. Fishing is one of the last wild harvests on the planet. And so we must ask ourselves the question, how many more harvests do we have at this rate? How will we ever restore a wild ocean with this approach? And bottom trawling is possibly one of the most destructive activities that humankind carries out at sea, an indiscriminate bulldozing of the seabed and sea life, as this image shows. At present, 55 of our 64 offshore marine protected areas are still impacted by industrial bottom trawling. We did analysis with Global Fishing Watch this year, and it showed that there are over 130,000 hours of industrial fishing in our marine protected areas. That's the equivalent of 5,000 days, or almost 15 years, of intensive industrial fishing in what we would have thought would be some of our most heavily protected areas. We also hear more and more about the importance of the restoration of blue carbon habitats, wild spaces, essential. We also hear more about the importance of and restoration of blue carbon habitats. Wild space is essential to ocean life and the absorption of carbon. Yet whilst an estimated 80% of seagrass, kelp forest, reefs and salt marsh habitats are nominally protected in MPAs, just 22% are safeguarded from bottom-towed gear. Banning destructive industrial fishing vessels and techniques from these areas, inshore and offshore, would be one of the most beneficial measures to truly protect marine life. We have the power to do this in the UK, as demonstrated by the recent ban on bottom trawling in the Dogger Bank, a hard-won campaign victory for the Blue Marine Foundation, for the Marine Conservation Society, Greenpeace, Oceana, and others. Good for nature, good for people. There's also a significant threat to unique marine ecosystems from the expansion of offshore oil and gas in our seas around the UK. Yet, in the last 2 decades, there's been no specific marine campaign to challenge this. Oceana, UK, is stepping into that space, collaborating with the climate movement leaders Uplift and marine organisations around the country. In March, we published a new report, In Deep Water, highlighting how the UK oil and gas developments impact marine life over wide geographic areas and long timescales. Because these impacts happen far offshore and mainly underwater, they've been out of sight and out of mind for far too long. But these impacts pose a serious risk to marine ecosystems and to our marine protected area network. These impacts and risks are far higher than you might imagine, and the rewards are far lower than the risks are worth. We must unite to drive the transition away from dirty oil and into renewable energy. Planet Ocean, one ocean that also connects life and enables marine ecosystems, biodiversity, and biomass to recover. The conveyor belt of life connects ecosystems and marine biodiversity around the globe. The sea has an incredible ability to bounce back from human impacts. The evidence in the ocean is clear. Where we give marine life the space to recover, it can, not only bringing ecological gain, but also supporting local communities. Wild seas can return. And we have many stories of hope from where the world has acted. The 1984 whaling moratorium has helped some whale populations bounce back from the brink. Humpbacks, blue whales, and more now thrive in greater numbers. Despite a minority of countries flouting the rules, the success is clear. And the whaling industry did go bust, but some industries will need to be put out of business as we move towards a sustainable planet. The world moves on, there are better ways, there will be some industries we can't keep happy. Global action on the ozone layer, a huge concern when I was a kid a long time ago, has been an incredible success too, with science showing how far the layer has now repaired itself. Now, my final slide, politicians continue to call for more science and evidence, yet we already have much of the data that we need. I wanted to share a final prescient quote from one of my favorite environmentalists, Rachel Carson. We stand now where 2 roads diverge. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress at great speed. But at the end lies disaster. The other fork in the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of life on Earth. It's now time that we redouble our efforts to guide this ship to thriving seas, to demand that words become action, and that leaders worldwide are held to account on protecting and restoring this amazing wild blue planet. Thank you.
Don't go away yet, Hugo. We have a few minutes for some questions, if that's all right. Has anyone got a burning question for Hugo?
As individuals, what do you think we can do to help us feel empowered in the marine conservation?
Could you repeat the question for those streaming online?
Yeah. As individuals, what can we do to feel empowered and to take action effectively? Look, one of the biggest things that I would say is vote effectively in the next general election. The ocean is becoming central to people's thinking. There are 2 big issues that are coming up, the sewage issue or the water pollution issue and offshore oil and gas and the transition away from that. So I'd say think about that as you're looking at the different political parties you might vote for. We can all take action in our own lives to reduce our footprint, and that's good. Do you want a beach clean? Refill your bottle, all of those things. But I believe that we need to create a new framework to live within, and that's up to government, and that will be about voting in the general election. So I would do that.
Yes.
So you're talking about the overfishing and stopping of the overfishing.
Mm-hmm.
So a similar question, what can we as consumers or our families and friends that are consumers that maybe refuse to cut fish out of their diet or don't want to, what would be your advice on labels, what to look for, what to do, what not to do, that we can share with people around us?
I would do everything you can to really understand the provenance of the fish you buy, and if you can buy it locally and sort of seasonally from your local fisherman, fisher person, or local fishmonger with a real understanding of where it comes from and how it was caught, and avoid the things that are caught badly in the wrong way, dredged, even some of the farmed fish I'd be careful of, because they take so much wild protein to grow that farmed fish. So, think about your choices, and of course, sort of try and eat sustainably. So that's what I would do. That's what I do already.
Yes.
I just wonder whether you can talk a little bit about the reduction of offshore oil and gas, and also the kind of the floating offshore wind that's proposed for the Celtic Sea here. And like you talked about needing to move to marine renewables. What do you see as the kind of positive impacts beyond the carbon reduction in our energy supply?
In our energy supply.
Repeat the
Okay.
question again.
The marine ecosystem.
The question is what are the sort of additional benefits of moving away from offshore oil and gas into offshore renewables beyond the carbon, and of course that's the sort of global warming, climate change debate, which of course also has an impact on the ocean chemistry because it's absorbing so much of it. Look, I think there is no net neutral or fully sort of positive outcome. We're all very energy hungry, and we need to find the sustainable pathway to run our cities, to fulfill that energy demand. And we need to think about what is the least harmful way of getting that energy, and renewables will come into that. Of course, fossil fuels are causing devastation around the world. I mean, we see the wildfires in Canada at the moment, and how they're even polluting Washington, D.C. and New York at the moment. So big are those fires, and this is all climate sort of driven and connected. Look, there are studies, there is work around the sort of the offshore renewables in terms of how they can create wildlife havens as well, how they can be more harmonious with marine life, how they can create even areas for low impact fishers to benefit from too. So there's a transition we need, and we need to make sure that we don't anchor those people who work in offshore oil and gas with an outdated industry, and help them move into a new industry that has so much potential for it. And that will be a battleground at the election. Now, I do understand, I've got really good friends in the fishing industry. I do understand the concerns about some of the types of offshore renewables as well, particularly the floating ones that you mentioned, because of the potential risks to safety around those sites. But I think this is something we need to embrace and explore with a multi-stakeholder approach to make sure things are sited in the right area, and that we can often have co-location with multiple benefits to it. But it's a journey everyone's on at the moment, and it's complicated, and there will be some benefits and disbenefits to any model that we have. But we do know we need to get off oil and gas as fast as possible.
I have one question for you, Hugo,
Yes.
And that is, a few years ago there was a lot of positivity about the UK government's approach to conservation, and they invested a great deal of effort and attention to protecting UK overseas territories, for example, and launched the Blue Belt Initiative. But latterly they seem to be running out of steam on environmental issues. What's your view of the potential to get any major environmental gains from the government in its last 18 months?
Look, I think we should keep highlighting that sort of almost paradox that you mentioned. Globally, the UK has had a strong leadership voice on the overseas territories, on leading people and countries on the 30 by 30 movement, the recent Montreal Agreement, of course, which has embedded that, protecting 30% of our land and sea by 2030. But at home, we're failing on that. When we look at our marine protected areas that I mentioned in the presentation, we're not protecting them from new offshore oil and gas developments at the moment. We're not protecting them from the most harmful types of industrial fishing. Of course, the action on plastics hasn't happened to the extent it should have happened by this point. We're seeing a U-turn potentially on a deposit return scheme. So actually the rhetoric hasn't been matched with the action, and it's something we need to keep holding this government and any future governments, of course, their feet to the fire to make sure we see words becoming action, because we haven't got any more time for delays. And on just to sort of labour the point on that, the bottled deposit scheme, which was committed to in 2018, 2019, still hasn't happened yet. You know, this is years later. These are relatively simple things that are being torpedoed often by industry. So more action to match the words.
Thank you very much, Hugo.
Thank you, Callum.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Much appreciated. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation and a very good background to the great work that you've been doing in Surfers Against Sewage and in Oceana now. And I think Oceana can look forward to a vigorous future under your leadership. So it's down to me now to talk about the High Seas Treaty and bring us to this big picture overview of what's going on at a planetary scale. And the High Seas Treaty has been a long time cooking, shall we say. And this picture of myself is when I was somewhat younger and had less grey hair than I do now. And you can see that I'm talking at the United Nations about the need to protect the ocean. And I remember one delegate who was less than discreet about what they thought said that I was barking up the wrong tree and that we'd never get the oceans protected, particularly the high seas, and that industry would occupy that space in perpetuity and everything was fine. So anyway, gladly, time has proven that that view was a minority view and that we have now moved on from there. So how did we get to a United Nations treaty from where we are? Well, first of all, let's just clarify what the high seas represents and what is covered by this United Nations treaty. The high seas represents areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is the collective shared space of humankind, and it's grown smaller over the years as countries have established larger and larger limits to their national waters, but this is about how far it's going to go. There is another process underway at the moment, which is to create extended areas of continental shelf, which will take up a bit more space. But the water above those areas of continental shelf will remain high seas and under international control. So about 61% of the ocean is beyond national jurisdiction. All of Antarctic waters are international. There's no exclusive economic zone there. And collectively, they represent about 43% of the world's surface. Now, most of us only experience the high seas from a seat in an airplane as we fly across them on some intercontinental flight. But in the past, we would have had much more opportunity to experience them at first hand, going on global ocean voyages to countries like Australia. Now, that space has been governed for a long time, since 1994, in fact, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, that came into force in 1994, but it actually goes back much further in time, and the drafting of the Law of the Sea was a process that was taking place from the 1960s into the 1970s, and so the exploitation of the resources in the high seas space really predominated in discussions and in the final text of the convention. And so we emphasize things about what we have rights to do and to extract from those waters and the freedom of navigation, for example. But there are duties here which have been largely forgotten about or kind of pushed to one side. And so there are duties to conserve marine living resources, protect and preserve the environment, etc. And we haven't been exercising those duties because they've been downgraded relative to the pursuit of profit and resources in the high seas. Well, that sort of has led to problems. the UN created a group of organizations called Regional Fisheries Management Organizations to manage the extraction of marine life from the high seas and international waters, but those bodies have not really been paying attention to the duties that they have to conserve and protect. Instead, they are just giving access to those resources to member states within those regional fisheries organizations and promoting extraction at the expense of sustainability. So one thing that we've seen is not just the spectacular declines of marine life that is supposed to be managed, such as the Pacific bluefin tuna here, but also the collateral damage which is impacting upon marine life in these open ocean areas. So I've been just incredibly taken aback in my career by seeing how fast these declines have happened, and a 99% decline in oceanic whitetips, for example. The leatherbacks have almost gone in the space of just 30 years. So, within the span of one career, you can see these spectacular declines. So just as you think you're winning on one front, you're losing on another. Well, the thing that a lot of conservationists have been working to do is to be able to get marine protected areas established in international waters. And one thing that science has been proving busily alongside the process of negotiation of the High Seas Treaty is that marine protected areas really work. And here are just a list of some of the benefits that protected areas can provide to fisheries, not just to the protection of biodiversity, but the ways in which they can potentially deliver into the exploiter's hands more profit, better fish catches, and improved revenue streams and sustainability. So these are things that marine protected areas can do, but the trouble is that there was no mechanism available to create them in approximately half the planet. The Convention on Biological Diversity gives countries the responsibility to establish marine protected areas, but only within their sovereign waters. It doesn't enable them to do it in the high seas. Now, in some cases, we went ahead and established protected areas anyway in the high seas. And I was a part of the efforts to create the first network of high seas marine protected areas in the North Atlantic, which was being led by the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. And my team did the science to decide where to put these protected areas. And we established the red areas as protected areas, the first network. But they were not universally accepted. They were established under a regional seas agreement, OSPAR, and countries like Argentina, which are not parties to OSPAR, complained that they hadn't agreed to this. And so this is a mechanism for creating protected areas that can be challenged. Nonetheless, OSPAR have continued to pursue greater protection for the area under their jurisdiction, and have expanded gradually that network in space to 1.5 million square kilometers, which I think is fantastic. Meanwhile, back at the United Nations, we see the wheels grinding along slowly. Nothing happens quickly at the UN, as I mentioned at the beginning. But eventually, an intergovernmental conference was convened by the UN to decide over the course of 4 meetings the wording of a treaty. Now, that treaty ended up being put on hold by COVID, as did many other things, and eventually the final text was agreed in 2023, in March of this year. And what was the aim of that treaty? Well, it was really to fill the holes in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to enable the creation of marine protected areas, to establish a mechanism for benefit sharing from marine genetic resources, which is the equivalent of the benefit sharing mechanism that has been established under the International Seabed Authority for the eventual sharing of profits from deep sea mining. More on that in a minute. And to create a mechanism for undertaking environmental impact assessments for new activities that take place in the high seas. So it got passed, and it's actually pretty good. It's a pretty strong treaty in many ways. And when it has been ratified, which is a process that will take a few years because 60 countries have to ratify this to bring it into force, and then eventually it will be binding on all countries. Once that happens, it will have a conference of parties created at which decisions can be made. They will be advised by a scientific and technical body, particularly on issues such as environmental impact assessments and proposals to establish marine protected areas. There will be a secretariat, of course, that will run everything, and there'll be a mechanism to disseminate information and create transparency in decision making. So this is, on the whole, a good mechanism. And the other interesting piece of this is that the United Nations generally makes decisions based on consensus, and consensus is very hard to achieve, particularly in a world that has become fragmented into different factions. Itself, the High Seas Treaty was a triumph of multilateralism in an era of fragmentation. And so I think we have to be grateful that that process continued even after all the upheaval in Ukraine and tensions with China. So it was agreed by everybody. But not everybody agrees to things like the management of resources or the creation of protected areas. So there is a fallback position that if consensus cannot be achieved, a 2/3 majority will do. And I think that's a very important way of making progress on this treaty. Now, alongside that negotiation, there was a different one going on, which was to agree on the 2030 targets for nature conservation under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And like the High Seas Treaty negotiations, this was also business that was put off from 2020. And eventually, at the end of last year, the world agreed to establish 30% of land and sea as protected areas by 2030. Now, what would that look like in the high seas? Here's a study that I was part of looking at where you would protect in the high seas if you were going to establish a network of protected areas covering 30%. The answer is you'd protect more than 30% because in any strategic decision making, you can't get a perfect network which will achieve all of your various goals to fit into exactly the target number. So this would occupy something like 38 or 39% of the sea to get those 30% goals. So this is a report that we did with Greenpeace to inform the process about that. There is a misconception that the High Seas Treaty, now it has been agreed, will lead to the establishment of 30% of the high seas as protected areas. Now, if we're going to achieve 30 by 30 at all in the ocean, it has to include the high seas, because if you were to put all of that 30% protection into national waters, it would take up 3/4 of the area of space that's under national jurisdiction. And it would not be representative because we're missing out those high seas areas. So we've got to get this right. We've got to establish protected areas under the High Seas Treaty. It's a facilitating mechanism. It's not going to lead inevitably to 30 by 30. And the other important caveat here is that deep sea mining is not in the treaty at the moment. And I have in my pocket a couple of examples of what deep sea mining is all about. These are manganese nodules, and the world is after resources such as rare earth elements, and people are arguing persuasively at the moment that we should go after them in the deep ocean. We don't need to go after them in the deep ocean because there are enough terrestrial sources, but in the ocean they don't come with the geopolitical baggage of who owns those resources to worry about. They do come with a lot of controversy, though, because where these resources occur is in places that are particularly rich in biological diversity. So it's a problem that mining, potentially one of the biggest impacting activities in the high seas, is not part of the High Seas Treaty. And so we need to be watching this space from all directions. So that leads me to the point where we conclude the presentations and move on to a panel discussion. And we have some great panelists with us who I will introduce to you now. So Joe Ruxton, MBE, and if you come up, Joe, and join us on the stage. As I introduce you, I'll get you to come and join us on the stage. Joe is the founder of Ocean Generation, a charity which empowers young people to fall in love with our ocean, as if they need any extra hand to fall in love with the ocean, and to find their own unique way to safeguard it in their daily lives and throughout their careers. Well, Joe first started the program for Joe started the first marine program for WWF in Hong Kong, where she lived for 14 years, and during that time was a key advocate for the establishment of the first marine protected areas there. She was also a lead member of the BBC Natural History Unit's diving team for many years and has been producing and directing underwater sequences since the first days of filming on the award-winning Blue Planet series in 1997. Joe went on to make another award-winning documentary called A Plastic Ocean, which was released in 70 countries and 15 different languages, and she was awarded the MBE for services to marine conservation, there can't be many of those, in the Queen's 2022 New Year's Honours List. Dr. Lucy Woodall is Associate Professor of Marine Conservation and Policy at the University of Exeter, recently moved from the University of Oxford to a much better institution. Only joking. She leads the scientific research at Nekton, which is a not-for-profit research foundation established to accelerate the scientific exploration and protection of the ocean. This is a really exciting organization which takes manned submersibles down into the mesophotic zone and just into the mesopelagic zone, at depths of several hundred meters down. Lucy's a marine biologist with a passion for sharing the importance of the marine environment with global citizens. She's a member of many applied working groups such as the High Level Panel, Expert Group for the UN on Sustainable Ocean Economy, the World Conservation Union's Species Survival Commission, Seahorse, Pipefish and Sea Dragon Specialist Group, and the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative Pollution and Debris Working Group. Thanks for joining us. And joining us online, and I think we'll be able to see Lora in a minute, coming in from somewhere across the ocean. Professor Lora Fleming is Chair of Oceans, Epidemiology and Human Health at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health at the University of Exeter, which is based at the moment, I think, in Truro, but is moving to the Penryn campus soon. Lora was the founder and director of the Centre for 10 years. She's board-certified occupational and environmental health physician. Thank you. We can see you now, Lora. That's great. An epidemiologist with over 30 years of experience and expertise in environment and occupational exposures and human health research and training. She's worked with diverse partners and communities concerning the human health effects of interactions with the marine environment and occupational health issues. She's a recipient of the 2013 Edouard Delacroix Prize and the 2015 Brune Medal of the International Oceanographic Commission for her research in oceans and human health. And it's a great pleasure for you to join us today. And you're launching a book on the oceans and human health today on World Oceans Day. Last but not least, Heather Koldewey is Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter and the lead of the Bertarelli Foundation's Marine Science Programme at the Zoological Society of London, and in her spare time, National Geographic Explorer. During her career at ZSL, Heather has co-founded Project Seahorse in 1996, set up a novel community-based supply chain for discarded fishing nets that are recycled into carpets, and was science co-lead for National Geographic's 2019 Sea to Source Ganges expedition, looking at plastic pollution sources there. Since 2017, Heather's been the lead of the Bertarelli Foundation's Marine Science Program, a transdisciplinary research and conservation program focused on Indian Ocean area and involving over 90 researchers from 24 institutions and 6 countries. The program is an endorsed action of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development and has a strong focus on regional capacity building for marine science. So thank you very much for joining us. And we'll have a discussion up here around some of the questions which have popped up through the earlier presentations. And there's also an opportunity for those of you who are listening online to post your questions in the chat, and they will be fed to the panel. And we would like questions from you in the in-person audience too. So think up what you'd like to ask people. And so I have a question to start you all off and get you thinking about things. All of you have worked for quite some time in the marine environment, and I'd like to ask, what changes have you seen over the course of your careers? And feel free to talk about positive as well as negative experiences. Starting with you, Joe.
I actually tend to talk about the positive, because if I didn't keep reminding myself of that, I probably wouldn't still be doing the job I'm doing, and I believe there's so much reason for hope. You did mention the work that I did in Hong Kong. I remember when I was first there, thinking that people just didn't care about the ocean. Hong Kong has as many species of coral as the whole of the Caribbean, and yet the local biology teachers didn't seem to know. We also have pink dolphins there and finless porpoises, but nobody seemed to know anything about them. And at the time, we had the biggest engineering project on the planet taking place, which was building Hong Kong's new airport. And I just thought, what a place to start trying to do marine conservation and setting up marine parks if the local biology teachers aren't even aware of what's there. But I honestly thought they didn't care. And through the work that we did at WWF, we started to put campaigns out and educate people and get talking to the press. And the change was absolutely phenomenal. And it just gave me so much hope, because I honestly believe most people want to do the right thing. They just don't know what to do, or they don't know enough about the subject. So Hong Kong, within 4 years, we had 4 marine protected areas. There's now 7. Each time I go back, I go and take a look at what's happening there. And I'm always, filled with hope from that. So the BBC was something else, because we were only showing the oceans as if they were full of life and full of fish, and that everything was fine. And actually, there were no people in most of the films, and I found it very frustrating to not be able to get the messages of conservation into the films I worked on. And again, it was, people aren't interested, and was constantly being told that it's all about bums on seats and entertainment. But when I left to work on A Plastic Ocean, I was amazed at how many people were interested, how far and wide that film went. I thought it would just be the kind of audience that we have here, people who are really dedicated and understand and want to learn more. But it was a topic that just really hit home with so many people. And then there have been changes. There was very little legislation on the plastic side of things. And now, with so much work that's being done, and obviously Hugo and everybody here actually has been part of that too. It's just building on knowledge and getting it out there and involving people, and that's very much the work that we do at Ocean Conservation, talking to young people about how they can either get a career in sustainability or bring an element of sustainability into the work that they've chosen to do. I'm hogging it. I'm really sorry.
Not at all. Pass over to, Heather's now you're both possessors of a microphone. Well, in that case, Lucy, we'll keep with seating sequence, and we'll just do the panelists in the room first, and then we'll go to you, Lora, if that's all right.
Thank you. Oh, gosh, it's really hard to come after you, Joe, because you mentioned so many awesome things. So I spent quite a lot of my time in the deeper waters. And actually in the deeper waters, it's really hard to go back to the same place time and time again, just because there's so much deep sea. And it's so logistically challenging and expensive to get to these places. So I'd say in the deep sea as well, we have a really long process. So it's actually really hard to baseline, because what I see at the beginning of my career might not necessarily have changed a huge amount at the end of the career, because I haven't seen it. Doesn't mean to say it hasn't changed, right? So in my work space, I would say the environment that I'm looking at probably hasn't changed. But I think, like you, Joe, actually how we interact with people, how I come in as a marine biologist, hanging out in the deep sea, that's pretty specialized and pretty siloed. But when we start to really think about how we as humans are impacting our environments, how the ocean is part of our lives every day, then actually our messaging and our communications and how we work with others is much more important. And I think those connections are much more evident today than they were when I started. And I remember conversations early on being like, well, you're a marine biologist, why do you want to go talk to the communities? And I was very fortunate because actually Heather was one of my PhD supervisors. And it was something that we really, really bonded over. When I was like, actually, I want to do more than that lab work. And I want to make sure that I'm listening and I'm talking and I'm really understanding about the values of the places that I'm working, to the people that are in those spaces all the time, and really learning from their lived experiences. So I would say that's the difference as well, is that there are more people like Heather around supporting that community spirit. Thanks.
And when I started my career, the typical way in which we did science was to parachute into a country, collect your data, take it away with you, and write up your results. And the local community were no wiser as to what you'd done or why you'd done it or what you'd discovered. And that's something you've been a particular champion of, isn't it, Lucy? Is to avoid doing parachute science.
Yeah, I mean, it is my passion, co-producing science, really listening to people who are living in places where I'm privileged enough to work and with whom I'm privileged enough to work with. I think is something that's really vital. Not only is it the right thing to do, but actually when we do this authentically and robustly, then we get much better and more results out of it that actually provide an appropriate legacy for the people with whom the ocean interacts every day. And I think that when we can get out of our heads that just because we've been privileged enough to sit in a lecture theatre somewhere and listen to a lot of the amazing experts here today, we don't know everything, and we can always learn from those interactions. And I think that two-way conversation of knowledge exchange when we're developing ideas is incredibly important.
Thank you. Over to you, Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has changed from, I guess, at the big picture scale, we know a lot more. We actually know what's going on, and we have the tools and techniques to study things. So we have a huge body of science that if we didn't do a single piece of additional science, we could still make a lot of very, very, very good decisions. And we have the frameworks that you mentioned, an increasing number from Sustainable Development Goals and all the national and international commitments that most countries of the world have signed up to. The bit that, for me, is the constant disappointment is that governments consistently fail to meet those targets, and nobody really seems to say anything. So if you imagined saying, okay, well, let's protect 10% of the ocean by 2010, getting there, realizing you got to about 1%, and then say, okay, well, let's just give ourselves another 10 years with no accountability and nobody really saying, that's not good enough. That's like, any other workplace or study place, you would not get away with that kind of poor performance. So that's one thing that always strikes me, is that we know exactly what to do. We've actually agreed, governments have agreed to do it, we just need to actually do it. The second thing is how much has changed in conservation. So when I was doing my degree at Plymouth, you couldn't study conservation. It wasn't a topic. And certainly when I graduated and when I started giving talks, I wouldn't, for those who are online, this room is primarily full of wonderful women. I would have been one of the few women in the room and probably not on the panel. It would have been a very male-dominated. The manel was a thing that was frequent and usual. And I think and the interdisciplinary nature of research wasn't a thing. So my second PhD student did work on livelihoods in marine conservation, and pulling together a supervisory panel that could agree on anything was really challenging. We had an anthropologist, a fisheries scientist, an ecologist, and me, and it was a mess because everyone wanted him to do the thesis of their choice. So I think now we assume that community-led or community-centered conservation is the norm, but actually that is a recent development. We are seeing how people fit in the space, that we need to listen, consult, learn, respect, and recognise that science isn't just Western science done through R, it's actually local ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and all of those elements form the body of science that can help us make the right decisions. And much of science is just generating what local communities have known for hundreds of years and many generations. We just have to kind of prove it in our way to show that it's right.
And testing it in R, that's that's one of the things that you have to do. Is if you're generating a study of local ecological knowledge, it has to be analyzable using the statistical means of the day, as many people here are very fully aware. Lora, over to you. Tell us where you are.
I'm in New York. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
I thought you were in Truro.
Yes, I just want to thank Callum and Emma and Peter and all your colleagues for arranging this. There's a slight lag. So anyway, I'm in New York right now, with a giant biomass bloom right outside your front door. So I think that's one huge change. Personally, for me as a physician, I've spent 40 years being the only physician public health person in a room of marine-centered people who are wonderful and totally were into the fact that our health depends on the health of the ocean. But I was kind of a pariah in the medical and public health communities, and even had a mentor who said, when I was doing harmful algal bloom research, that it was career suicide. So from an academic point of view, I think that's changed. I think we should unfortunately thank climate change and COVID. Now, physicians and other healthcare providers and public health people are beating on our doors to want to talk about how their health depends on the health of the world, of natural environment, and of the ocean. And I think that's a huge change, and for me, extremely exciting and very positive. Other things that my colleagues have already emphasized, the fact that there's a lot of women involved. I would also point out a huge number of youth, and I don't want to take the road that it's up to youth to save us all, but it's very exciting to have them and their energy involved, focused on the health of the ocean, and in my case, human health. And again, indigenous and coastal people, their expertise, their experience is now finally being taken seriously. And even though I'm a quantitative person, Callum, I would say that there are other ways of analyzing data. Qualitative work does not necessarily use statistics. And finally, I think the fact that marine protected areas that you've described, Callum, and others, is a huge area for research and collaboration and potential experimentation and learning, both the people that live in them and around them. And what can we learn from them about how to live more sustainably going forward? So I guess those are the areas that I would mention right now.
I think is clear is that all of these different data sources are so important to bring to bear on the question of how to manage our relationship with the planet better. And you in particular have throughout your career been looking at the rather unconventional area of the influence of the environment on human health, and in particular the influence of the ocean on human health, and have as I said at the beginning of this presentation, you've got a book that is coming out today, sort of distilling some of the findings of this, both from your own team and a group of others who've been working on this particular area. We have a very healthy-looking audience in here, which is what you'd expect from everyone who's interested in the sea and has such good access to it here in Cornwall. But what would you say the top-line findings that you have made about the connection between health and the ocean would be?
I started out my career very focused on risks. So I looked at things like harmful algal blooms, microbial pollution, chemical pollution, et cetera. But as already been mentioned by several of my colleague panelists, increasingly I found that that was important research, but I think equally important is to point out the opportunities, the benefits that human health and well-being can derive from the ocean, with the caveat that we always have to remember the health of the ocean. So over the last decade or so, I've been privileged to work with researchers from around the world, looking at how, in many ways, many interdisciplinary ways, as well as working with local populations who live in coastal and other blue environments, how interacting with these blue environments is good for our physical health and mental well-being. And I think we now have a substantial body of evidence. I think there's a lot of work to be done around a couple of areas, at least. One of them is that increasingly, particularly in the so-called developed nations, these blue areas, particularly ones that are high quality, are exclusive. And people of color or other marginalized communities may not have access to those high quality blue environments. And so I think there's a lot of research to be, what are the barriers? Some of them are very obvious, but also how can we make blue environments, which we know are good for our health and well-being, how can we make them more accessible, for example, to disabled populations, people of color, et cetera. I also think there's a huge piece of what is a healthy, sustainable interaction between our blue environments and humans. There's a huge movement now, particularly in the developed nations, around blue prescriptions. We're sending people to our beaches, our coasts, et cetera. I think that's fabulous, but I think we're going to love them to death if we're not careful. So how do we work with people who are involved in conservation, as you've heard from some of my colleagues? How do we actually think personally no-go areas where humans can't go, but how do we have areas where people can interact in a sustainable way going forward? And also, how do we respect the groups, indigenous and other coastal peoples, who have worked in those areas for thousands of years? What can we learn from them about how to go forward sustainably? And how do we deal with things in the deep ocean? And I'll point that another sort of change is Lancet actually has a commentary led by Tony Capon today, talking about the deep waters and how deep water, deep sea ocean is important for human health. It's not just the coasts. It's the things it's the unseen, the unknown unknowns. So I don't know if that touches on some of the things you were hoping I would touch on, but I think that's really important.
Thanks very much, Laura. I would like to invite the audience in the room to pitch a question to any of the panelists. Yes.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Just I guess to everybody really, with respect to things like deep sea mining and 30 by 30, how do we achieve lots of our objectives without further kind of disenfranchising the developing or like, I guess, global south?
So the question for those online is, how do we achieve things like 30 by 30 and banning deep sea mining or managing it without further disenfranchising the global south? Who would like to kick off on that? Joe.
There are many, many ways that need to work together to do this. I can obviously talk about the work that we're doing, and what I found interesting with the teaching that's happening now in schools is how little the ocean actually comes into focus. And it was really brought home to me recently when I was sitting in a rock pool with one of my granddaughters, and there was beautiful kelp in there, and you could see bubbles on it. And I said, look at that beautiful kelp giving us oxygen. And she goes, but Nana, the trees give us oxygen. And I thought, it's still being taught that all of our oxygen comes from trees. If we grew up knowing that the ocean is our life support system, we might have more respect for it. So it's a way, we have a program called Bringing the Ocean to the Classroom, and the idea is it's in children's DNA, knowing how important it is, knowing what our relationship is, and how our actions can either harm or help it. That's kind of starting at those levels. But certainly with policymakers, a lot more harder hitting campaigns. But it's getting people educated, it's talking about it, it's understanding our circle of influence and how we can do that through the things that we buy, through the people we talk to, through our social media, through letters that we can write to governments. All of us can change something. So for me, it's about making people understand and letting them know, because if you know you're doing some harm, very few people actually want to do that. And being part of a solution, even if you're just changing one thing, is a way forward.
Lucy.
Hi, I think that's a really good question. It's absolutely vital. We know that actually disproportionately impacted countries are those that are of low GDP, and we know that from many of the different impacts that human activities have put around the world. We've each got different agency. Everybody in this room has a different ability to change what they have, because we've all got different opportunities. And I think we really need to have that reflected within our goals and our treaties, and understand and listen to each other about those lived experiences, about those changes that are going to be positive. So really thinking about not necessarily stopping doing something, but how do we change that behavior so that it has positive benefits? So for example, using a plastics example, how can we make sure that there's potable water into a community rather than saying we want to remove the single-use water bottles? So it takes a little bit of creativity. That was a very easy one that I just gave today. But we can only make sure that we come up with those solutions that have multiple benefits if we are ensuring that we have the right voices at the table. And I think we've still got a little way to go to make sure we can ask the right questions and therefore also get the right solutions together.
Heather, yeah.
I guess I would just add that some of it is the power and positionality, but looking at who's at the table and who's able to represent, and some of that is providing more access and more support for the equivalent NGOs and scientists who are often able to go to policy events, but to be able to support more representation from the Global South at those events and being able to have those voices and those opinions heard. To look at, there is a real need for finance, and there is a real need for recognition of the challenges of some of the locally appropriate solutions and some of the problems. So while the High Seas Treaty was a very positive development to actually have one after so long, it happened at the cost of the Global South. So the Global South had to make a number of sacrifices they didn't have the support for, and lost out on some of the compensation mechanisms that were being discussed as a result. So it was an unequal treaty, and so it's now going to be, how do we tackle that through implementation? I think there's some brilliant voices stepping up and speaking out on that, and social media does help with that because it makes for more equal voices. It's our job to amplify, to listen, learn, amplify and support, and be good allies where we can, and recognise the impact that such decisions are coming primarily from the global north on the global south.
It's an important question, and I'd like to ask Lora for her views. You've looked into this in some detail, I think.
Well, actually, I would say my colleagues have more expertise in this, but my personal feeling is this is not solely the issue for the ocean. You have the whole financial discussions around compensation and alternatives with the COP, with climate change. And I think we need to show good faith in the wealthy countries in terms of addressing current issues that are right now in front of us. And then several have been mentioned by my colleagues, such as drinking water, rising seas, where are people going to live, infrastructure that's being impacted. They need tangible, not solutions, but approaches right now. And that, I think, would go a long way towards building trust that we will do more in the future. And the other thing is just not to silo biodiversity from climate change. It's all interconnected, even though we do it in the quote unquote bite-sized pieces. So I think building the trust and addressing current issues, not just endlessly talking about the future, I think would go a long way.
And I think I'd just add to that mismanagement of resources is actually not in the interests of the global south or the global north. except in the very short term. And at the moment, there are a handful of players who have the technological capacity to exploit the high seas, and they're taking all of the gains, and because it's unsustainable, are eroding all of the future gains. And so one of this year's winners of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement is Rashid Sumaila, who's an economist who's looked into this in a lot of detail. And a few years ago, I co-authored a paper with him on closing all of the high seas to fishing. And in fact, the analysis said that that most countries would be better off as a result of closing the high seas to fishing, because most of the resources can be exploited in their own national waters. And that the skew in the rewards that is currently going towards those handful of technologically advanced nations would be unskewed by closing the high seas and letting resources recover and taking advantage of them in home waters. So there's different views on this and how you might redistribute access to resources which come through. Another question from the audience. Now, Jess, you've asked one already. Can I have one from somebody else who hasn't asked a question, or I'll circle back to you. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit about enforcement of the protected areas. As Hugo mentioned earlier, there's a lot of paper barks. Nancy and I work in Seychelles for Aldebra MPA, which has just been extended under the 30 by 30 Seychelles, but enforcement of that protected area is really hard. There's no resources for it at government level. So I wondered if you could talk about that and how we might achieve that enforcement, especially if we're going to extend those onto the high seas.
So for the benefit of those online, how can we enforce protected areas so that they really deliver the benefits that they're supposed to? And the example given is of the Seychelles, which on paper has met its 30 by 30 commitment in the sea at least. And, we are going to be seeing more and more scrutiny of this particular problem in the future. So let's start with Heather this time.
Thank you. Thanks for that easy question, April. I think there's a number of areas of development. Obviously, Hugo presented some global fishing watch data and the advent of satellite technology to be able to know who's doing what and where, as long as they're a big enough vessel to have the satellite monitoring systems on board. But that has been a huge step change in being able to monitor and enforce from space instead of relying on boots and boats on the ground. And we're looking at similar developments using listening devices for engines, using drones, lots of technological advances on that, which is exciting. That has to link, obviously, to prosecution and enforcement, which means countries have to work together through the Port States Measures Agreement to do that. I think some of the interesting research that colleagues are doing within the Marine Science Programme I run is the other way around, is why are people poaching there? Why are people incentivized to go there? And what might change that? So they have been looking in the Indian Ocean region around why acute problems from poachers from Sri Lanka on small wooden boats with no technology, or from India. So we have colleagues in India, Sri Lanka, and the UK working together on a social science project to understand who's doing the poaching, why they go to certain places. And that has, and what might change that, what might incentivize behavior change. And that has been incredibly informative, learning things that even looking at the long lines that get left behind, if you measure between the hooks, that will narrow it down to 3 different villages, because the different measurements respond to traditional practices in different villages, or understanding what's a deterrent and what's a behavior change. So I think we need to, that's where thinking differently about it, not all just like, right, how many guns and boats and stuff do we get to stop them, is actually why are they going in there in the first place. And often it is driven by either fairly criminal forces or by social structures or by a very small, tight-knit family groups of people who've sort of explored this option and found it very lucrative. So when we know that, then you can start looking at what's the appropriate way of tackling that.
Yes, Lucy.
Thanks, Heather. I think you covered most of it, but I think I do want to mention about thinking about targets, right? 30 by 30 is great because it's a designation of a thing, but there's lots of paper parks, and we mentioned paper parks around the UK. We have marine conservation zones designated in 2019, and many off our coastline here in the south coast of the UK still don't have management plans. So there's no possible way even of enforcing them if there's no management plan. So I think that it's really important for us to think, how can we get a message that's slightly more nuanced than 30 by 30, which is absolutely important. That's the first step, and go actually to achieve what we want to achieve by 30 by 30 means that it needs to be highly protected, and the only way to do that is to ensure there is management and an enforcement mechanism in, and we're only going to get that management when we're talking and really understanding with the stakeholders about how to ensure that that's going to happen, because we're never going to have enough money and enough resources to just stop people from entering a space. And actually, we want to be thinking about, is that the best way of achieving those goals that we have for those areas?
Joe.
Well, so much has been said, and I have very little to add, other than to say, when the economy drives the environment, I think there's ways of feeding into that. For example, with marine protected areas, when the fishermen are on board with it, how much better they do and how much more money they can make from keeping these areas protected. And that news gets out. And the other comment I want to make is actually something I know very little about, but I know that the Blue Marine Foundation were giving prizes out for technology that can help the ocean. And one of them was through a researcher in, please don't ask me about this because I can't answer, a researcher in Australia who had devised a very simple method using the radars of existing ships to actually be able to detect the ships, the small boats as well, that are moving in a sort of suspicious way, so they can actually find out who's doing it when they haven't been able to use more sophisticated techniques. So if anybody knows more about that, I'd love to know. And I can, of course, ask my colleagues at Blue Marine Foundation, but it just made me think about it. So I do think that, you know, success in these stories needs to be spread, because then people will realize actually there's more profit to be made from keeping it healthy. And if you look at the price of a whale alive compared to dead, and how much they can bring into the economy, even if it's just simply by well practiced whale watching, for example, and what whales do for the economy.
I can answer the question, Joe,
Okay,
as one of the judges on that panel. And the answer is that, you know, one of the problems with radar is that you can't get over the horizon very far, and so you can't see the boats that are out there and operating. And
I wish you'd said earlier, by the way.
and you know, one of the problems is that the outer Great Barrier Reef, for example, is beyond visibility for organizations and agencies. And so by putting the radar of all those party boats, those super yachts, etc., to some really good use, then this can expand the visibility of people doing things at sea that they're not supposed to be doing. And I think that's one of the things which is happening is that, you know, we really are leaving people few places to hide. And the other thing is that governments in the past have hidden behind their protected area commitments. So to return to the question, they have created protected areas, but then made it easy for themselves by not doing anything in them, not doing any implementation. And now we can see that they're not implementing those, and we can hold their feet to the fire. Lora, you haven't said anything on this. Would you like to add anything?
I would actually, and it's sort of along the lines of what's already been said in terms of monitoring. I was lucky enough to be part of a GCRF, wonderful now historic funding, working with colleagues in Southeast Asia in marine protected areas, UNESCO biospheres, and some marine parks. And it was the Blue Communities Project. And what we did was we worked with local communities who are living there, and part of it was monitoring their health and well-being, and they actually did part of the monitoring. So I think traditionally we've looked at it purely in economic terms, livelihoods, for example, or as Joe just said, you know, how much is a whale worth? But you can also show people that their health and well-being and that of their children is improved by certain activities happening in marine protected areas in and around them. I think it's important to talk about around, not just in, because there's a lot of activities that happen around these marine protected areas that also can be very beneficial for human health and well-being. And I think the other thing is I have a colleague who's been looking at mortality data and whether countries have marine protected areas or not. And over a period of several decades, he's been able to show, and this has been submitted for publication endlessly, that the countries with marine protected areas have less mortality, better mortality in both women and men in a number of countries. And I think it's tying it to health. It's not everybody's endpoint, but tying it to human health and well-being is incredibly important, and involving those local communities in seeing that their health and well-being is protected by these marine protected areas is also very fruitful.
Thanks very much, Laura. And we're running close to the end. We've got some questions from the online audience here. Is it the case that the International Seabed Authority will receive funding from mining royalties? That is a question of which I'm not sure of the answer, and I can just ask my fellow panelists if they know the answer to that. And the answer is no, thank you. We'll move on rather than planting
probably know somebody who does, so we can get back to them after.
We can do that. But the International Seabed Authority is responsible for the distribution of royalties from mining to the international community from the countries that are responsible for the exploitation of them. I do know that. Is citizen science a useful method to both interest and educate the wider public in ocean health? What do you think of that? Joe, I'd like to pass over to you first.
No, I really think it is. I think a lot of people are getting overwhelmed by the bad news, and they feel quite helpless, and we're constantly bombarded. And you think about the ocean, you're starting to think about acidification, melting ice caps, pollution, coastal development, all of these things that are affecting it. And yes, we need to know about that. But the trouble is, if you just sit and think, well, listen, I've got to be a politician or a marine biologist to be able to do anything. And that's not the case. Anything you can do from educating yourself is going to make you part of the conversation. But the citizen science then brings people in, because they'll then talk to others and understand what's happening. And you don't have to get that degree to be part of it and to actually be part of the change and behavioural change. So yes, I do think it's a good thing.
Great. Heather, have you done any citizen science? Have you been a part of that?
Well, I will actually nod to Hugo, because I'm a trustee of Surfers Against Sewage, and I think they epitomise how you can use citizen science to drive change, just by everything from volunteer action to cleanups to the data collection that has been done through looking at tracking some of the health issues that are arising from people from the sewage scandal and poor water quality. And I think we've touched a lot. We've talked about Global South, challenges of enforcing one of the most stunning places on the planet of Aldabra. But actually, the UK is one of the worst offenders in Europe in terms of our biodiversity loss, our marine protected areas, our water quality. We rate the worst, and it's like, we have no excuse at all to do that. It's incredible. So I think what we see with citizen scientists engaging, mobilizing, collecting data, getting involved, signing petitions, voting, making it an issue that our politicians need to care about, is absolutely critical in this country, because even though we have the resources and wealth and even talk about it a lot, we're not doing it. And we have no excuse that many other countries do when they don't have the resources and more imminent problems of war, famine, huge problems. So that's one frustration, obviously.
So problems don't usually get solved until they're visible, and I think citizen science has a big role to play in that. Laura, you got your hand up
Callum,
here.
I apologize. Yes, I apologize. I have to leave because I'm taking care of elderly parents at the same time. I'm part of the sandwich generation. I just want to mention that the other piece, again, is like was just mentioned, linking citizen science to health, but also the people who are doing the citizen science are their own sensors. Is doing citizen science helpful for their health and well-being as they interact with the marine environment? And we've also used that with blue tourism as well, although I realize that blue tourism is a whole nother discussion. But thank you so much for this panel. I've learned a lot. I'm really thrilled to meet some of my panelist colleagues. And thank you, Callum. I apologize. I just have to go right now.
That's fine. Thank you very
much.
much, Laura, for your great contributions. So final thoughts from the panel. Are you positive about the future? Is the tide turning? Lucy, do you want to start? Since you didn't have anything to say on the citizen science, which was not because you didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't ask you. Sorry.
That's right. My panelists did a great job on the citizen science component. Short and sweet because we're running out of time, as you said. Am I positive? Yeah, I have to be, right? Because otherwise it can feel completely overwhelming, and it's really easy to get into the mindset of just feeling very unempowered within situations. But I think, as I've said before, we've all got different agency in our lives, and we can all do something, and that will be different than the person who's sitting next to you. And I think it's really important that doing something doesn't mean to say everybody's got to do the same thing. So am I positive? Yes. We've heard about all of the amazing changes. Have we got to go further? Yes. We've really got to think about how our oceans, and we've seen it on the images today, how the ocean connects us as a planet, it connects us as a people, it connects us across our lives, our disciplines, where we've come from, and our personal heritage. And those are going to be different, but that is literally one thing that connects us. And I just want to leave you with one image that I found really powerful. My wonderful colleague, Dr. Jean Harris from South Africa, shared this with me. And she said, the ocean. When I talk about the ocean to people who don't get to experience it, I talk about lifting the blue blanket. And maybe that's just a little image to take with us all today. How can we lift the blue blanket for ourselves and for others around us to make sure that we can see what's inside of this amazing space?
Thanks very much. Joe?
I do feel very hopeful, and I know that there's a lot of people who are working for the ocean and studying it, and whenever we have these conferences or these gatherings, this question often comes up, and every single time people say, yes, I believe there's hope. And I've just spent some time with Dr. Sylvia Earle, and one of the things she said was that everybody on the planet now, this is such a special time, because before we were making a lot of mistakes and we didn't know what the solutions were. We now have the science, we now have those solutions, we have the knowledge of what we need to do. We've just got to do it and persuade the people that aren't on board with it to how to make change and how we'll all benefit from that. And I think everybody has said the same thing today in a different way in the work that they're doing. So yes, I am very hopeful.
Heather?
Well, I'm not going to spoil the party. So, no, I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't have difficult days. And as a scientist, looking at the data and the trends and the graphs and the charts, etc., can be pretty daunting. But you do also cling to all of the positivity and opportunities. I think two things just to finish up on in using quotes. One is from Jane Lubchenco, who's an amazing researcher and advisor to the Biden administration, and she said, we are very short of time, but we are not short of solutions. And that one gave me hope. And the second is from Asha DeVos from Ocean Swell Sri Lanka, who said conservation is about building the biggest team in the world. And I think that's how we need to look at it. We're seeing many different sectors, from finance to insurance to technology, to more traditional students, to health experts coming into the ocean conservation space. And everybody is welcome. Everybody should feel they have a role to play, and they can, because that's what we need.
Thank you very much. And basking in the sunshine of your positivity, I would like to thank all of the panelists and our speaker, Hugo Tagholm, for sharing their experience with us today, and the audience for coming along. There is a lot of work for you guys to do in your careers, and what makes me positive is seeing how many more people are interested in solving these problems and working towards cleaner, healthier oceans and a better, more equitable planet, and one which can be sustainable into the future. So thank you very much, and to the University of Exeter for hosting this event, and to the team who have put it on. We're very grateful to you. Thank you.